I would like to actually address some of the questions that Professor Mohanty raised right at the beginning, and I think those are very critical. They have been raised to some extent by both the speakers. May I please add to that? I'd like to say that, first of all, we mustn't forget that the NEP 2020 and the 2019 draft was projecting itself as the Government of India's resolve to create a vibrant, public, equitable, quality education system. So we mustn't forget that this is the projection, and a lot of people have fallen in this trap. Many people are actually looking at this as an admirable document, and I think we need to understand that. Yes, it does talk of, for example, interventions at the ECCE level. It talks of foundation literacy and numeracy, rearrangement of curricular and pedagogic structures of school education, reorganization of teacher education, and a new institutional architecture for higher education. But if we look at this policy closely, we realize that there is very little in the policy that tells us that the policy is addressing what is on the ground. So it seems to be disconnected from the ground, and the proposals that are being presented in the policy, I think, are likely to exacerbate inequities and create a far more inegalitarian system of education and, of course, society. तो मैं ये कहना चाहती हूँ कि इस पॉलिसी में इक्विटेबल एजुकेशन का मसला है, जो हमारे कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल फ्रेमवर्क से आता है, वो इस पॉलिसी से कहीं कहीं बहुत दूर है. उस मसले को ये पॉलिसी एड्रेस ही नहीं करती है, और जो भी प्रस्ताव इस पॉलिसी में रखे गए हैं, वो सभी प्रस्ताव शायद इस इनइक्वालिटी को, जो कि एजुकेशन में है और सामाजिक स्तर पे कई तरह की इनइक्वालिटीज हैं, जैसे कि जेंडर, सोशल, कास्ट वगैरह वगैरह, उनको ज्यादा बढ़ावा देने का ही काम कर सकती है. तो सबसे पहले ये कहना चाहूंगी कि आरटीई की बात दोनों स्पीकर्स ने बहुत अच्छे तरह से रखी. प्रोफेसर महंती ने भी कहा कि आरटीई एक्चुअली है ही नहीं इस पॉलिसी में. आरटीई इस्टेब्लिश कैसे हुआ था? वो एक ऐसा एक्ट था जो कि क्लियरली इस्टेब्लिश करता था कि इट इज द ड्यूटी ऑफ द स्टेट टू प्रोवाइड equitable quality education for all children. We expected the 2020 policy to extend the RTE to downwards and upwards, as was mentioned in the 2019 draft, but this has not happened. And as Professor Dubey said, the legal underpinnings having been established through RTE or near universal enrollment are the only two aspects, and to my mind, the mention of RTE in the 2020 document is like mentioning an initiative of the past, and they have sort of done away with it. Now, what NEP seems to be emphasizing nevertheless, and I quote, it says equitable quality education from foundational stage to grade 12, that is to 18 years, but it does not say what are the suitable facilitating systems. So it's actually not even giving us a structure by completely doing away with any mention of the RTE. So by rearranging the curricula, which, as Professor Govinda said, is probably not very new, we already have the middle stage, etc., etc. But the point is, by giving us a new sort of structure in terms of curriculum and pedagogy, not in terms of school infrastructure, it actually confounds the fact that RTE has not been extended. It gives a false veneer that there is an extension of RTE, but it isn't. The state has actually failed in implementing RTE, and therefore there is a silence. The silence glosses over the fact कि इंडिया का स्टेट स्कूल्स का जितना शेयर है वो अब केवल 65% रह गया है, और एक कारण इसका ये है कि स्टेट ने इन्वेस्टमेंट ही नहीं किया. अगर आप 1970 से लेके आज तक का ट्रेंड देखें तो गवर्नमेंट स्कूल्स की संख्या निरंतर गिरती गई है, और ये एक और कारण भी है कि स्कूल्स को मर्ज किया गया गया है, बल्कि नीति आयोग का 2018 में ही 7E प्रोजेक्ट के नाम पर मध्य प्रदेश, झारखंड, उड़ीसा में कम से कम 40,000 स्कूलों को मर्ज किया गया है। ये भी एक बहुत बड़ा कारण है। और जिस तरह से इन स्कूलों को मर्ज किया गया है, अगर हम ध्यान से देखें तो ये दूर दराज के इलाकों में है, जहां वो कहते हैं एनरोलमेंट कम है, इसलिए वो इकोनॉमिकली वायबल नहीं है। इस तरह से उन्होंने आरटीई को पूरी तरह से डाइल्यूट किया गया, क्योंकि एक्सेस टू एजुकेशन पे भी एक प्रहार है, एंड दिस इज गोइंग टू अफेक्ट स्पेसिफिकली द गर्ल्स एंड द मोस्ट डिसएडवांटेज हु विल नॉट बी एबल टू वॉक मेनी किलोमीटर्स to actually come to attend schools. Now, by doing this, several states that have already tried to achieve progress in this area of access to education are going to be pushed back. I think that is the key problem with this policy. What NEP does is actually it legitimizes school merger, क्योंकि ये बात को बिल्कुल साफ कहती है कि छोटे स्कूलों को हमें रैशनलाइज करना है, उसको इकोनॉमिकली ऑप्टिमल बनाना है, सब ऑप्टिमल है इस वक्त। लेकिन उसी समय ये पॉलिसी स्कूल कॉम्प्लेक्स की बात करती है, जो कि कोठारी कमीशन के बिल्कुल अलग एक कॉन्स्ट्रक्ट है। इट इज नॉट एट ऑल व्हाट कोठारी कमीशन सेड, बट इट इज टॉकिंग ऑफ अ स्कूल कॉम्प्लेक्स विद इन अ रेडियस ऑफ 5 to 10 kilometers. So we don't understand the logic of this. The policy is silent on RTE, and that brings closure to the government of India's earlier attempt to dilute RTE by actually reducing RTE to a right to learning from a right to education. And this happened through the Niti Aayog recommendation, and it was the third amendment that was made. So in a way, because the state has failed and continuously we see a decline of the state schools, equitable education तो दूर की बात है, ज्यादा बढ़ावा दिया गया तरह तरह के स्कूलों को, जिसमें कि लो फी पेइंग स्कूल्स भी हैं। अगर हम CSF जो सेंट्रल स्क्वायर फाउंडेशन है, उनकी रिसेंट रिपोर्ट में उन्होंने कहा है, और ये उन्होंने मिनिस्ट्री का SOPI का डेटा कोट किया है, 50% ऑफ स्कूल्स इन द प्राइवेट सेक्टर पे लेस देन ₹500 per month. Right? Now, this is the kind of school structure that we are giving encouragement to through the new education policy. And also in the COVID times, there is another report that parents are pulling their children out of the private schools because they cannot afford it, they have lost livelihoods. इसका ये मतलब हुआ कि इस तरह का जो स्कूली ढांचा है, जो हमारा पूरा छा रहा है और जिसको नई शिक्षा नीति 2020 बढ़ावा दे रही है, वो ढांचा सस्टेनेबल ही नहीं है, वो बंद होने को जा रहा है। तो क्या हम इस तरह से अपनी यूनिवर्सलाइजेशन का प्रॉमिस फुलफिल करेंगे? ये एक सवाल उठता है। NEP actually makes requirements for schools to become less restrictive. वो RTE का नाम नहीं लेते, पर RTE को अमेंड करने की तरफ इशारा करते हैं, जो कि 2019 पॉलिसी ड्राफ्ट में क्लियरली लिखा गया है। It is talking of non-government philanthropic organization alternative models. मेरे हिसाब से इस तरह का प्रावधान दो तरह के स्कूल्स को बढ़ावा देगा, और वो एक है लो फी पेइंग पब्लिक स्कूल्स, जिसको अब ये मांग की जा रही है बाय सेंट्रल स्क्वायर फाउंडेशन काइंड ऑफ ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस दैट गवर्नमेंट शुड सपोर्ट देम बिकॉज पेरेंट्स कैनॉट पे द फीस. द सेकंड काइंड ऑफ स्कूल्स दैट विल गेट encouragement is the one teacher schools of Ekal Vidyalayas, which are over 1 lakh already, and they are expanding phenomenally. These schools also have the problem of ideology associated with it. So the states that actually moved away from one teacher schools in order to adhere to RTE norms will now be pushed back into again the same system of educational inequality in terms of structure. Second point, which is really most important, is the fact that the Constitution of India established categories of scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and then with the Mandal Commission OBC, by putting everybody in the so-called socio-economically disadvantaged groups. एक बास्केट में सबको डाल दिया है. आप actually Supreme Court and plus the Constitution of India, जो Supreme Court ने बहुत बार अपहेल्ड किया है, आप उसको ही उल्टा रहे हैं. We are by putting everybody in one basket. So we are not recognizing the constitutional categories. We are violating them by putting them all together and mixing them. The other thing is, if you put all these SEDGs together, अगर आप देखिए उन्होंने किस तरह की बातें की हैं, including girls, minorities, disability, SC, ST, poor, everybody, तो ये तो हमारी 80% पॉपुलेशन हो गई. 80% पॉपुलेशन के लिए आपके पास एक सेग्रीगेटेड स्कूल सिस्टम का प्रस्ताव है इस पॉलिसी में, क्योंकि एसईडीजीज के लिए अलग से स्पेशल एजुकेशन जोन्स की बात की गई है और उसमें छोटे सर्टिफिकेट कोर्सेज फॉर टीचर ट्रेनिंग की बात की गई है, कम्युनिटी लेड वॉलंटरी इनिशिएटिव्स की बात की गई है, पीयर ट्यूटरिंग की बात की गई है. इसका मतलब अब हम पॉलिसी से साफ साफ कह रहे हैं कि एक अलग तरह का सिस्टम होगा इन एसईडीजीज के लिए और बाकी 20% के लिए एक अलग सिस्टम होगा और उसमें कंपटीशन बढ़ेगी, क्योंकि हमारे पास ईडब्ल्यूएस 10% जो कि अभी रिव्यू में चल रहा है सुप्रीम कोर्ट में, वो भी एक मसला हमारे सामने है. व्हिच मींस वी आर क्रिएटिंग अ सेग्रीगेटेड स्कूल सिस्टम, अ सेग्रीगेटेड टीचर एजुकेशन सिस्टम्स, एंड वी आर फंडामेंटली challenging and violating our constitution. But I think EB should have accountability to the categories of the constitution, and I personally think that this is also against the JVC, because the JVC, the Justice Verma Commission on Teacher Education, had very clearly said that the first teacher training program should be face to face and not ODL, which this policy talks about. It also said very clearly that we should have both models, not only the 4-year integrated, but also the 2-year after graduation, which this policy is condescendingly saying it will be made available. But largely it's talking about 1-year programs and it's talking about short-term certification. JVC also said very clearly that the integrated program should be actually targeted clearly for different stages of education. As Professor Govinda says, this policy talks of 1 B.Ed with a specialization for foundational, preparatory, middle, secondary. But the point is, this is pedagogically unsound. You cannot have one teacher training program for all levels. I will quickly talk about 2 issues with regard to governance structure, because that comes under higher education and we haven't yet talked about that. The regulatory structure of higher education says that there will be national level 4 areas of regulation. One, of course, regulation, accreditation, funding, and curriculum. As Professor Mohanty said, a common curriculum for the whole country. Not only that, the discourse of school education actually violated the very idea of quality that JP Naik talks about. That idea of quality is now being applied to higher education by saying that there will be a national level body that will work out learning outcomes for each higher education program, whether it's professional or whether it's liberal arts. Can you imagine पूरे देश में एक तरह का करिकुलम? तो डाइवर्सिटी की तो धज्जियां उड़ा दी आपने डाइवर्सिटी की बात तो की ही नहीं, डेमोक्रेसी की बात तो की ही नहीं, पर आप बार बार रेटरिक के तौर पे इंक्लूसिविटी की बात करते हैं. बट इफ यू क्रिएट अ कॉमन करिकुलम which is standardized, then we are not going to be able to address the important problem about this regulatory structure is that there will be likely state center conflict, because the state education is a state subject. States have their own regulatory provisions. it is concurrent, but it is largely state. There's a lot of element of the state autonomy in it, which will now be taken away, and it will become more centralized and largely in the hands of politicians. Now, if you talk of a rejuvenated, instead of the Rashtriya Shiksha Ayog of the 2019 draft, you've just done very little to change, because basically you're quoting the same aspects of how the CABE will operate to re-envision policy and education and curriculum from time to time. So what is the problem by centralizing and taking the power away from the state? Uska problem ye hai कि firstly it goes against our federal structure. Secondly, culture and language are both aspects very particular to each state. We have states that are linguistic states, and I think by centralizing these powers, we are taking away the power from the state to actually enable progress and prosperity and development in the area of languages and culture. And I think that will create a huge conflict between the two. The last point I'd like to make here is that the homogenization process actually is going to lead to a veneer of choice, by saying, just like in Delhi University, we have a choice-based credit system, but if you look at each college, there are no choices at all. If you look at the schools at the Delhi Directorate of Education, after class 9, after class 10, when the child has to choose certain streams, what is happening is that the schools are deciding your marks are not very good, so you will get only beauty culture. You will not be allowed to study political science. Now, this choice is just a veneer. It's not going to happen, because the control and the regulation of curriculum is going to be entirely in the hands of not only national regulatory bodies, but it'll trickle down to schools as well. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Those points, particularly about how they have completely ignored or diluted the whole concept of desirable teacher education. That was very important. And then the regulatory structure, how it completely devastates the federal structure and is likely to create center-state conflict. And diversity has given a goodbye in so many ways. Even though perhaps it is mentioned a few times, but the whole structure really completely violates our commitment to diversity. Thank you very much. We have a number of very interesting questions. We have about 40 minutes for discussion. I'm so glad everybody spoke within time, more or less. And I will take a few questions which have been communicated on the chat box. And before I read, I will request all the three panelists, when they respond, I think we will have 2 or 3 rounds. In one of the rounds, I would like them to address what we should do, how we can get around this crisis using the existing institutions, existing center-state framework, existing political situation, and what resources do we have, if we have any, to really pursue our objectives while continuing to critique this policy. I think you will please think about that and give us some insights. Now, in the first round, let us take some of these questions which have been in the chat box. Here is one. There is no mention of accessibility, reasonable accommodation, universal design for children or students with disabilities. Students with disabilities. How are they going to be included in the education system? Just by saying it, it won't happen. It is equally applicable to every child, student with disability everywhere. So that's one. Let me read out 3 questions right now. This is from Snigdha Sarkar from West Bengal. The next question, what will be the economic impact of the NEP Is the government capable of making changes to the budget and allocate more funds to education, or is that not required? This is from Dr. R.S. Singh. Another question. One person reflects on the lack of mention of common school system in the policy document. Maybe Professor Dubey can elaborate on that. Yes, I think he should. Next, I think let me give you a few more questions and take them in one go in the first round. Arvind Mishra says, how to use education to combat against the trend of growing inequality in our society. I think this has been addressed to some extent by the speakers, but you can say more on that. Question of Facebook live stream. The question is, what will be the effect of multiple exit points and distribution of certificate? Will it improve the dropout rate or not? Then what are the possible implications of increase in investment of foreign private capital in education and a gradual withdrawal of social responsibilities of the state? What is the nature of knowledge being produced then? What about access? Maybe one more I will read and then stop because there are so many questions. Professor Govinda, in line of your point of administrative reforms, which is so rightly pointed out, should we also not ally against that? It is government which designs the policy and implements it, funds it, and also evaluates it. It's sheer conflict of interest and just a status quo that they want to perpetuate this existing system, that means. Your thoughts on this, please. That is from Mahasweta Biswas. Let's take these questions, whichever you would like to take.
I'll address those issues which have yet not been addressed. One, I think the question was with regard to future of teacher education. I'd like to say a couple of things on this. One, that the policy does not even look at the existing issues that we have. For example, in the 2019 draft, there was talk at least of 10 lakh vacancies at the school level of teacher vacancies, but there is absolutely no mention of that. The existing system is actually inundated with para teachers, contractual teachers. How are we going to address that? In terms of institutional capacity, there is absolutely no word, and which was the key thing that actually the JVC had recommended, that at the state level, there is very poor institutional capacity to develop teachers. And also the fact that the state investment is very low. इस वक्त हमारे देश में 95% से ऊपर टीचर एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूट्स प्राइवेट सेक्टर में है. अगर जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर काम नहीं करता तो वो इस तरफ आके देखे कि टीचर एजुकेशन में कैसे प्राइवेट सेक्टर ने बिल्कुल काम नहीं किया, क्योंकि जब TET इंट्रोड्यूस हुआ, दैट इज द टीचर एलिजिबिलिटी टेस्ट, व्हिच अगेन दे हैव टॉक्ड अबाउट, एक्चुअली द क्वालिफाइंग नंबर्स फॉर TET वर एक्चुअली एज लो एज 1% and they probably went only as high as 15 or 17% in some states. तो अगर हमारा टीचर एजुकेशन व्यवस्था ही इतनी खराब है इंस्टीट्यूशनली, करिकुलम वाइज एंड पेडागोजी, क्या हमें उस तरफ ध्यान नहीं देना चाहिए? केवल एक एसोटेरिक 4 साल का एक तरह का प्रोग्राम बना के हम ये उसको एड्रेस नहीं कर सकते हैं. The other issue is again with regard to teaching for diversity. Our current teacher education programs have no provision to teach for diversity when all our classrooms are actually diverse. तो अगर ये शिक्षा नीति एक नॉन डाइवर्स होमोजेनाइजेशन की तरफ बढ़ रही है, तो वो चाहती है कि टीचर एजुकेशन भी होमोजेनाइज हो, लेकिन ये संभव नहीं है हमारे देश में. तो ये बहुत बड़ी चुनौती हमारे सामने है.
This covers the disability dimension.
No, I'm going to address the disability because disability is also put in the SEDG group. Right. So disability is also in that one basket. I do not think that disability has been addressed at all. And I feel diversity has to include the element of disability because this is a very high proportion of our children and our adult population is within this. We also have teachers actually who are visually impaired in our own department, for example, and everywhere. And how do we create create an appropriate pedagogy for these children who have difficulties of all kinds. The other important aspect is with regard to multiple exit points. ये जो 1 साल का choice है, फिर उसके बाद 2 साल का exit point है in a 4-year undergraduate model. I think this is again to basically push out the students. It's not a question of choice, because eventually the system will push them out, because you want to take them towards a non-academic stream into vocationalization. Vocationalization per se is not a problem, but the way it has been presented in this policy, it actually is talking about looking at vocationalization as if it's meant for those who cannot manage academic knowledges and academic pursuits. And I think that's a very wrong way of looking at it. We can have a perfectly good program for let's say tourist guides, which have an excellent grounding in history, which enables a liberal arts education to make somebody take up the vocation of looking at how to enhance our tourism in terms of historical places and so on, and link it up with school education. So I think that is a big problem. The last point, certainly with regard to foreign private capital, Professor Govinda has already spoken, but I think there was an important point raised here with regard to nature of knowledge. And I completely agree. The more it goes into the private hands, the research agendas are going to change. We saw that in school education, as over the years we have seen since the time of DPEP, research agendas of school education have only been driven by policy, and policy that talks about very specific things. It doesn't talk about teaching learning processes. It doesn't look at education as process.
Right. Thank you very much. Let's take another group of questions. One question is, this is from Seema Rajput. NEP is retrogressive. It doesn't talk about RT. The policy cannot ignore the legal framework, and the special training has been negative. I think that's more a comment really, but you can reflect on that. Another is from Anubhuti Patra. What should be our key priorities for advocacy and response? Should the focus be primarily on protecting RTE norms to begin with? That's a good question. Another, the RTE is still a constitutional act. Is RTE still a constitutional act? How can it be made effective again? In Odisha, the merger of schools and the push for residential schools is affecting tribal areas very badly. Meaning, what should we do about it? Next, from Dr. Alex George. On the restructuring of the school system with a 4-year stage after the 8th class lead to more dropouts and increase in child labor as it amounts to long 4-year stage. Also, it is said in the NEP that skill development will start in the 6th class, which would give further push to this process. So let us take these questions, and there is also a question on this. I think let's first take up these questions.
Just say a couple of things. One is that certainly the policy is paving the way for private schools as well as higher education centers. There's no doubt. I don't think it is even sort of hiding it. It's saying it very clearly. The issue is that when it talks about, bringing in special education zones and enabling quality, equitable education for all, it doesn't seem to connect to the reality that in the past few years, actually there has been a substantial reduction in the education budget over the 5 years, which has led to reducing allocations to scholarships for the marginalized students. So many of them were not able to, and therefore they were affected in the sense they could not continue the education. So certainly allocating more funds is not even there. The 2019 draft at least talked about it in some way. way, even though there was inadequacy in the way they presented it. But right now, there's no talk about that. Clearly, they are leaving it and pushing it in the private sector. And in terms of the curricular and pedagogical restructuring of school education, of course, there will definitely be the risk of more high dropout. And already with the pandemic, we see many people losing their livelihoods and children being pushed into labor again. That is, we are seeing that already happening. In fact, what we have seen is a vulgarization of inequality on the streets of every city that we have seen for so many months now. But I think the more important thing is that by rearranging these curricular pedagogic structures, even though it may not mean very much on the ground in terms of infrastructure, but it is going against the constitutional categorization of elementary education. And the RTE is directed towards that. So we are diluting the constitutional provisions every time we are trying to change these things. And that is where we need to actually direct our objections and our struggle.
Last word.
Well, I think I've said
also
enough.
on gender, if you want to add something.
Okay. Well, gender. Gender too is part of SEDGs.
Exactly.
So actually there is, and I think the impact on girls will definitely be very high, specifically in terms of school mergers and privatization, because we already know that in whenever there's the option of sending a child to a private school, which many parents have been preferring for in the name of quality, they have been sending their male children there, and girls have been left in so-called state schools. So gender is certainly a concern. I think it is an equal concern at the higher education level as well.
Thank you. Well, friends, I think this has been an extraordinarily useful discussion. And there are three main points. One, RTE must be reiterated and expanded, at least in our framework. Professor Dubey reiterated about the common school system, and that still should be our goal, and how the conditions in the local environment can be created by persuading political parties, state governments to make the existing government schools move towards common schools, making the private schools superfluous if possible. And common school has to be the goal. So that is number one. RTE has been ignored in this draft, in this policy statement, no longer a draft, though it lacks legitimacy until it is passed in the parliament. So it has been ignored, and we have to reiterate our full commitment to RTE and to strengthen it. Number two, I think the socially, educationally disadvantaged groups, I think that's a very unfortunate way of handling inequalities and calling it a equitable and quality inclusive education. It is not. And therefore, all sections of our society, their political and social organizations, political parties, groups, Dalit groups, gender groups, Adivasi groups, Adivasi youth groups, Dalit women groups, workers' children welfare groups, construction worker groups, all groups should have a critique, a sectoral critique, sectoral assessment of this policy, and have an agenda cut out how to make their constitutional right possible by moving in the direction of new education policy that they would like to have. This is number two. Number three, I think the centralization that we have seen is unprecedented. Cooperative federalism has given a go-by, and these four or so regulatory bodies which seek to centralize everything, I think they have to be challenged. And the concurrent list gives enough power to the states to have their regulatory bodies that can decentralize regulation also, and supervision also, and coordination also to district and block level. and panchayats have to be brought into the implementation of the RTE in the full sense of the term that we are discussing. Therefore, decentralization has to be pursued as a goal, and this centralization has to be questioned. I know it is difficult because the resources are centralized in the hands of the state, hands of the central government, and central government pledges to give more resources to the private sector than to the public investment in education, health, and the like. So we have to keep on pressurizing, use the electoral weapon, movement weapon, and the way they have critical role to play in different sectors. We have to use those critical roles that people have to pressurize and demand reallocation of resources to education and health particularly, and with a view to promoting equality. Finally, here is a notion of education. It says that it combines humanities and with skill, but that is only on paper. The underlying motive is to robotize education. The focus on skill and vocationalization, and make it so dependent on the net and the IT and the global network of technological things and capital intensive technology, making it impossible for the poor and the deprived to take full advantage of new education, as we have seen during COVID, during online facilities of education and so on. And that is going to be the new norm. So privatization, foreign institutions coming to India, and this whole motive has a new definition and a very blatantly clear definition of education as skill, not as integral development of mind and skill and values, which the RTE Act said in the preamble, or the Common School Education Commission report had talked about in the beginning. In other words, we have to really work hard to promote humanities, liberal arts, social sciences, and also make RTEs the line of most important work. Only then the base for having bright people come from a wider base for research and innovation and higher education and development, that will emerge. If the base is weak, then the entire system is weak. And this new education policy threatens to keep the base weak, divided, unequal, privatized, and robotized, besides communalized. We didn't discuss very much on communalization as an underlying theme. So with these words, I once again thank you for a great discussion. May I invite Ambarish Rai to have the last word. Ambarish.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for a wonderful moderation, and people will get involved into that. और मैं इसी के साथ साथ जो हमारे आज के स्पीकर्स थे, एमिनेंट स्पीकर्स, उनको भी बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद देना चाहता हूँ, और ऑडियंस को भी. एंड वी विल कीप इट ऑन, और नेशनल एजुकेशन पॉलिसी को लेकर के चर्चा और हम लोग करेंगे, और फिर देन वी विल, जैसा आप लोगों ने कहा कि एक पॉलिटिकल मूवमेंट अराउंड द यूनिवर्सलाइजेशन ऑफ एजुकेशन, नॉट ओनली universalization education, but extension of the RTE will be the core issue. The whole school education should be the justiciable right for every child in this country. तो वो लेकर के हम लोग आगे बढ़ेंगे, और इस पर मोबिलाइजेशन देश भर में किया जाएगा. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद सर, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद. एक वंडरफुल डिस्कशन, वेरी वेरी, यस सर.
Bye bye.
Thank you.